Okay, so what we're going to be looking at, obviously, in this section is the presidency of Andrew Jackson, or the age of Jackson, Jacksonian democracy. So, seeing as how Jackson's presidency, Jackson rather, gets a whole almost era, a whole sort of phenomenon of Jacksonian democracy kind of named for him, that should automatically suggest that this is going to be a presidency, or his is going to be a presidency of remarkable changes, of a lot of major events and transforming things happening. The presidency itself, the country itself, transforming in a very significant way. We're going to look at more of that tomorrow, so I'll save the stuff about what makes Jackson so different and all that sort of thing. Right now, we just want to get the background to Jackson getting elected and talk about how that demonstrated some changes that were going on in the country politically. Now, one of the major aspects of what we know of as Jacksonian democracy has to do with democracy expanding, and we'll talk more about that tomorrow. But I want to just comment for a few minutes on the whole political party situation and how that was undergoing some structural changes and fundamental changes in the Jackson era, and it's part of how Jackson gets elected. So if you remember, this era of good feelings, and the coming of Jackson kind of symbolizes an end to that era of good feelings, and there's really not an exact date on it. But in that era of good feelings, what political parties did we have? Sorry, go ahead. Just the Republicans. Not to say they all agreed on everything, because they didn't. There were plenty of divisions within the Republican Party. But by the time you get to the time of Jackson, that becomes split again, and we have two new political parties again. So we're going to look at that really quickly. So that kind of rift, again, it had always been there. It's not like everybody always agreed on everything. But it starts to become more noticeable as a result of the election of 1824. The election of 1824, this was the first time that Jackson ran, and he was one of the candidates, Andrew Jackson, who we know from the War of 1812. And in this election, there were actually four different candidates. They were all Republicans, because everybody was Republican. And with there being four different major candidates like that, that tends to skew the results so that there isn't a clear winner. Because in our election system, whoever has the most votes is not necessarily the winner. That's not how it works. You don't get the most. You have to get a majority. You have to get 51%. And when there's more than two major candidates, that can be harder to do. So in this particular election, no one had the majority. Nobody had the magic number that you have to get. Well, the Constitution does speak to this. They expected that to happen. In fact, they expected it probably to happen more than it actually does happen. So the Constitution does say when that is the case and there is no clear winner, then it goes to Congress, and Congress decides how to allocate the votes and who to be the winner. So the election of 1824 ends up in Congress to decide. You have these four candidates. Congress decides to immediately throw out the bottom two, looking at the two that were in the third and fourth place, and leave it between the two candidates that had the most. Neither of them had a majority, but the ones that had the most popular votes and the most electoral votes, so it came down to Andrew Jackson. Which one?
Interruption. We need to follow a student to the main office. Brianna Mills, Janona Jackson, Alexis Brown, Caleb Hurston, Lily Holland, Elizabeth Key, and Jason Chris. Please report to the main office.
So it comes down to Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams. Okay, so John Quincy Adams, we talked about last week, he was Secretary of State under Monroe, guy that probably wrote the Monroe Doctrine, or at least had a lot to do with it. John Quincy Adams, he was one of the candidates as well. So it becomes a showdown between Jackson and Adams going into the House of Representatives to decide. Now, again, no one had the clear majority. However, Jackson was leading. Jackson did have the most, certainly in the popular vote. More people had voted for him than had voted for Adams. However, who do you think the House of Representatives is going to choose as the winner? Adams. So Adams is going to end up the winner of the election. So if you're Jackson and you went into this thing, the leader, and then Congress comes comes back and declares your opponent the winner, what would you be thinking, or what would you be feeling? Be pretty angry, which Jackson and all his supporters are. Furthermore, they're more than just mad. Jackson and his supporters are going to allege that something shady went on here. And they're going to call this election, the election of 1824, a corrupt bargain. That is what the Jacksonians are going to refer to it as. They're going to call it a corrupt bargain. What are they suggesting, do you think, happened here? Yeah, that there was some kind of exchange of a deal here. And here's why they think that. The Speaker of the House, the person who directs the House debate and would have a lot of influence over the way people voted, was Henry Clay. Henry Clay had been one of the four candidates. He was one of the third or the fourth one. I don't remember which one, but he had been, tossed out of the race. But it just so happens that when Adams becomes president, when he's sworn into office, Henry Clay becomes his Secretary of State. He's named by Adams as his Secretary of State. So what do you suppose Jackson and all his people are alleging took place? Yeah, so they're alleging that there was some kind of a deal made. They're alleging that Clay and Adams made a pledge to each other or something, and Adams said, hey, you swing the votes my way, and I'll make sure that when I'm president, I'll appoint you as Secretary of State, which is a very high office, and at this point was kind of seen as sort of like, if you were Secretary of State, it was sort of like being heir apparent to the presidency, because a lot of presidents had been Secretary of State prior to. So they allege that something like that happened. So that's why they call it a corrupt bargain. Now, we have no evidence that such a thing actually happened. So there were never any, formal allegations made. And again, there's no proof that that took place. But Jackson's people, of course, will believe that forever and ever. And so for the next 4 years, while Adams is in office, Jackson's people are going to be, still angry and bitter over this corrupt bargain, as they call it, alleging that they were robbed of something, that the election was illegitimate, that Adams is not a legitimate president, so forth and so on. So this rift within the Republican Party starts to become more and more pronounced over the next 4 years, and they both start adopting kind of different names for themselves to sort of distinguish themselves from other Republicans. So everybody was a Republican going into this, but over the next 4 years, it starts to split. And one group starts to call themselves Democratic Republicans. Those are the Jacksonians. So Jackson's supporters start referring to themselves as Democratic Republicans, trying to say that they were a little bit different. And in doing so, they are trying to invoke the memory of Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party, that we are the true believers in a Republican government. We are the true believers in the people having power, very much considering themselves sort of heirs to the whole Jeffersonian philosophy. However, as you can probably imagine, Democratic Republicans is kind of a mouthful to say. And so eventually that gets shortened to Democrats. So not immediately, but within the next handful of years, Democratic Republicans will get shortened to Democrats. And so typically when we think about Jackson, think about him being a Democrat. And while 1,001 things and more have changed since then, this is the predecessor of the modern day Democratic Party. Adams' side, also Republicans, but they start calling themselves National Republicans. What do you think they're saying about themselves? By calling themselves National Republicans. Yes, they support nationalism, among other things. Remember, Adams is a big nationalist, so nationalistic policy, so they start calling themselves that. So the next 4 years, it's Democratic Republicans and National Republicans, but just like Democratic Republicans is kind of a mouthful to say, so is National Republicans. So eventually, they're going to start calling themselves Whigs. So the National Republicans are soon going to be the Whigs, WHIGS. And so those will, by 1828 or so, those will be your two new political parties, Democrats and Whigs. And we're going to have Democrats and Whigs for a little bit. So tomorrow we'll pick up with Jackson, the rematch, 1828, Adams and Jackson at it again. And this time Jackson will win. And we'll talk about why and what all that means. The American system stuff, if you have not finished that, you need to finish it tonight. I'm going to extend that till tomorrow. So that's due tomorrow when you come in.